history of science, but clearly they were excluded. They were excluded from universities. They were excluded from practicing science. And they were excluded from many other institutions. But she has jumped from that very real fact to the idea that therefore science must have been guided all along by what she calls a masculinist epistemology. You know, there is an essence of what it is to be a male. We are controlling, we want to control nature and submit it to our control, and we want to dominate nature that way. That is part of the epistemology. So had we just included more women in science, we would have developed an entirely different thing. Hydrogen and oxygen and all that wouldn't exist. There would be all the things in their place. There would not be genes, there would not be anything, there would not be solar systems, there would not be, it would be an entirely different thing populated by entirely different entities, because that male urge to dominate nature would not have existed. But you can imagine what I think about masculinist epistemology, right? Now, I don't want to start dumping on every single feminist that writes about science right now, because I already got into enough trouble yesterday. But I don't think that they are doing a service to feminism. Feminism was based from the beginning on precisely attacking the social conservative ideas of men. Social conservative ideas about abortion, social conservative ideas about what gays are or are not, social conservative ideas about what the role of women should be as domestic workers and as mothers. Ideas that came from religion. From the beginning, the content of scientific fields and feminism were allies. Because with ideas from science, you can demolish any of those myths that come from the conservative right, one at a time. And you can show perfectly well that abortion is not infanticide. You can show perfectly well that there is no principle behind nature that makes marriage to be, between a man and a woman, and everything else is some aberration. You can show perfectly well that there is no particular set of traits that identifies women versus men, an essence of masculinity versus an essence of femininity, because all that genes determine, with exception of the capacity to bear children, every other secondary sexual characteristic is distributed in a population statistically. And therefore, any secondary sexual characteristic that is used to exclude women from particular fields, such as the fact that they are supposed to be less strong because they have a higher fat to muscle ratio, can be debunked by science or by the content of scientific fields by showing that on average women have a higher fat to muscle ratio. But the two statistical distributions of the secondary sexual characteristics overlap to a large extent, showing you that they are not mutually exclusive essences, but simply something that exists in a population. And you can also show, using the content of scientific fields, that exclusion from training from early on, seeing as unfeminine the fact that little girls are playing soccer, or seeing as unfeminine the fact that little girls are climbing trees, or seeing as unfeminine that little girls are doing any kind of physical activity, exaggerates the distinction that is purely genetic, related to the fat to muscle ratio, and thus end up creating women that are much less muscular, but in a way that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, in a way that it is the lack of training that amplifies whatever effects are due to hormones. So, utilizing the content of scientific fields, feminists can very effectively fight the mostly religious beliefs of the conservative right, the ones that they are, in fact, your enemies. By talking about masculinist epistemology and pretending that with a single brushstroke you can dismiss the entire content of physics, the entire content of chemistry, the entire content of biology, and so on, it's a bad strategic move. It's like shooting yourselves in the foot. And yet, science studies has an enormous branch that is the feminist side of science studies that is also trying to do the same thing. Of course, those feminists are idealists. You would think that, As I said the other day, when women were excluded from universities and they were excluded from having a work in just about any area, with the exception of wars, in which you needed women as as phone operators, or you needed women to do to fill the jobs that now men that are fighting in war cannot do it. With that exception, women were taking care of the material aspects of life. It was their husbands, their lazy-ass husbands, who went to universities, didn't have to do anything material, and could become idealists and think that everything is just a matter of signifiers. So you would think that when feminists finally broke through that barrier, they would bring their materialism with them. They would say, look, we are the original materialists, because we were doing the material world. We may not have been developed a materialist philosophy, but we were the original practical materialists. There is no way in hell we're not going to adopt the worst part of male's ideology, which is the ideology of idealism. And yet, that's exactly what happened. So, the reason I'm mentioning all this is because in addition to the Deleuzian approach to scientific fields, to try to demystify axiomatics, to try to point the finger at those aspects of scientific history which have been subservient to government institutions and hankering for power and hankering for a more dominant position in the power structure. There is also all these nomadic fields that are constantly tracking singularities in a divergent way. In addition to that way of looking at science, which already demystifies what scientists themselves believe about themselves, there is this other field, science studies, which is just modeling, it's just obscuring this goal. They are basically, that's why I introduced them at the beginning of the class as a nuisance, as an annoyance. These are people that are not going anywhere because their ideas are very bad, but that nevertheless have captured the highlights, or the spotlight rather. Now, I'm not saying that Bruno Latour doesn't have a single good idea. Bruno Latour, and I happen to know the guy, is an intelligent guy who has hit on a few good ideas in his work. The problem is that he is not famous for those few good ideas. He's famous for strident statements like all laboratory facts are socially constructed. In other words, they are all social conventions. Science studies, and this is the last thing I'm going to say about it, because it's sort of like a soda commercial where you're like trying to advertise Coke, but you end up talking about Pepsi, and you don't even know you're maybe selling Pepsi by using the name Pepsi so much in your commercial. It's the last thing I want to say about these people. They focus on scientific controversies, because scientific controversies, in science there is such a thing as competition for being the first one to have claimed a discovery, and from the beginning of the history of physics in the 16th century, there has been competition as to who was the person who discovered what. For instance, one thing that we're going to talk about later, the calculus, the differential calculus, which of course is dear to Deleuze because it has the word difference in it, and because it's about rates of change, about speeds of becoming. The software, so to speak, the mechanical recipe for the differential calculus was discovered simultaneously by Newton, an English guy, and by Leibniz, a German guy. And both wanted to take credit. Perfectly understandable, because the differential calculus up to the 20th century was the main mathematical tool for physicists. So if it's the most important mathematical tool, well, you want your name attached to that tool, And there was a bitter controversy between Newton and Leibniz that lasted throughout their lives to see who would get credit for that particular thing. Now, those controversies are clearly social. There's nothing, particularly when they get nasty, and particularly when they get nationalistic. An even better example occurs in the field of chemistry at the end of the 18th century, when a French scientist named Lavoisier and a British scientist or an English scientist named Priestley both